Welcome. Welcome to Move to Learn, which is the Handspring webinar for manual therapists and movement educators. Today is Wednesday, November 18th, but of course it depends whether you're joining us from Josephine Key's city of Sydney, Australia, where it's Thursday, or whether you're somewhere else in the world in North America or elsewhere. Our guest today is Josephine Key, who's a physiotherapist, a manual therapist, and a movement educator. As a neuro-musculo-skeletal physiotherapist, educator, and author, Josephine Key is the author of Freedom to Move, Movement Therapy for Spinal Pain and Injuries. Before introducing Jo Key, let's take a look at what you can expect in how the webinar will proceed. This is how things will work. The webinar will comprise roughly 45 minutes of discussion, presentation, and guided practice, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. The chat is on, so do say hello and tell us where you're joining from. We welcome your questions. Please submit these questions using the Q&A button on your screen. We aim to finish on the hour, but we may continue for 10 minutes after the hour to ensure that we answer as many of your questions as we can. We understand that sometimes your enthusiasm for questions may mean that your questions will show up in the chat, so we'll do our best to toggle back and forth between the Q&A and the chat to make sure that everyone's comments are acknowledged. We are recording the webinar and will share a link to it in our follow-up email. We are also streaming live on YouTube. And we draw your attention to the disclaimer. This discussion is for informational and illustrative purposes only and is not meant to impart medical or therapeutic advice or instruction. We refer you to Freedom to Move, Manual Therapy for Spinal Pain and Injuries, written by Josephine Key, for further information. And now I'm delighted to give you the biography, the bio, amended, of course, abridged, of Josephine Key. Josephine is a neuromusculo-skeletal physiotherapist, educator, and author. She established Edgecliff Physiotherapy Sports and Spinal Center in Sydney in 1985, which I trust was before some of you were born. Her major interest has been in developing an improved understanding and more effective rehabilitation of spinal pain syndromes. Josephine Key has distilled the relevant research and integrated this into her practice. In pursuit of best practice, she has also examined, road tested, and both incorporated and discarded aspects of countless therapies and exercise systems, gradually evolving a clinical model of musculoskeletal function and dysfunction. She calls this model the Key approach. It's a whole person, integrated systems approach which offers a different paradigm around functional movement and how changed spinal movement control, even during the most simple everyday activities, is directly related to most spinal pain. Josephine Key has established the registered trademark Key Moves program of therapeutic exercise and movement classes in effect since 2001. Presently, nearly 40 classes a week are conducted within her practice. This program rests upon the tenets of the Key approach and is constantly evolving as new clinical and research evidence comes to light. Josephine has had a number of papers published in the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies. Her paper, The Core, Understanding It and Retraining Its Dysfunction, was one of the 5 most downloaded papers from that journal in 2014. Josephine Key, welcome to Move to Learn. I can't wait to hear and learn from you. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm just wondering if anyway, I don't need to say my view. Thank you very much for that very fulsome introduction. and it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Given that you have numerous slides prepared for us from your book, would you start in, and you can either follow the slideshow or take off on a fascinating tangent.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. So if we could have the first slide. So this slide just tries to eclipse what freedom to move encompasses. It describes the model of dysfunction that I have evolved, and it offers a model of healthy spinal function, which is both based on the evidence and natural movement, which serves as a blueprint for the practitioner to break up movement and to understand the key aspects of control that are missing, and so to offer a more staged rehabilitation program. Fundamental to the approach is what I call the fundamental patterns, and breathing is of course the most fundamental, but then we have the axial pattern, the pelvic and the shoulder and the head patterns. And so when the approach attempts to help distill what's wrong in your client and help you to see how you might fix this, to break it down. So if we can look at the next slide. The pelvis is really key to everything that happens to the slide. If you look at the picture on the left, that's a conceptual idea of neutral, where the thorax is balanced over the pelvis, where you have balance in the flexor and extensor systems of the axial body. When the pelvis is moved forward, this is a standing view, in more flexion, as the pelvis moves forward, the spine is more flexor dominant, and as it moves back, there's more extensor dominance. What's important to see in those two lateral figures is the oblique relationship that starts to occur between the spine and pelvis, and that has big implications for the ability to organise the core and breathing. So if we can go to the next one. So essentially, clinically, if you look at patients, there are two basic clinical subgroups, which are based on the altered alignment of the way the spine stacks itself up against gravity and how people move. And Yander was my first big influence there. And these two syndromes also contribute to another of his concepts called the layer or the stratification syndromes. And these are really both important that you can appreciate them, because it's going to have a big impact on the way that you examine your clients and what you choose to prescribe for exercise. It's important that we don't increase that person's dysfunction. So if we can have the next slide. So this represents one of the subgroups. It's called the posterior pelvic cross syndrome. This was Yander's original concept. The pelvis is back. Note the poor tone in the whole abdominal wall. To get the spine upright, this person has to rely on a lot of extensor activity of the spine, the muscles in the extensor system. This creates a lot of compression in the spine. Note also it's associated with, in the upright position, some hip flexion, which then has problems for the patient being able to fully extend the hips. If we can move to the next slide, you will see that this is a conceptual idea of the crossed pattern. And what we're talking about here is imbalanced activity. And you'll see the red cross shows that you've got a lot of overwork of the thoracolumbar extensors with the deep hip flexors, particularly psoas, and that's matched on the other part of the cross with very underactive abdominal wall, the muscles in the pelvis, and also the lumbosacral extensors. And then so now if we look to the next slide, we will see the other basic clinical subgroup. Here, it's called the anterior pelvic cross syndrome because the pelvis has moved anteriorly or forward. Note here the hyperactivity in the upper abdominal wall and the relative underactivity in the lower abdominal wall. Also note the very poor gluteal development and the poor calf development. These people posture themselves in full range hip extension, and therefore they have trouble opening up the posterior hip and myofascial chain. So if we see on the next slide, there's a conceptual cross here. So their overactive muscles are the upper abdominals, and then we've got piriformis, glutei, hamstrings overactive. And this tethers the pelvis, stops it moving, and creates stress on the spine. Notice its postured inflection. And we have, again, the lower abdominal wall is weak, as well as the low lumbar extensors. So if you come back and think about this, does it ring any bells for you? Can you see which subgroup cluster you might belong to? Because they are clusters and there will be variability. So I'm showing you the features of both, and your clients will often I might be wanting to have a bet both ways, but often we see a mixed syndrome, which can be features of both. And that depends what the person training thing is, what their occupation is, what beliefs they've had about which exercises to do. So if we move on from that, we get another syndrome, as I mentioned, called the layer or stratification syndrome. This is best seen in the body from behind. And if you look at this subject, notice over the posterior shoulder girdle between the scapula, there's very poor muscle tone. In fact, the spine is quite kyphotic there. But if you look at the region from her bra strap to her waist, you'll see that she's got a lot of extensor activity. They're almost like salamis. And then if you look at the lumbosacral area, there's very poor muscle tone. So we see these stratas or layers. And on the next slide, you will see that I've attempted a conceptual drawing. So let's look at the one on the left for ease. Notice that there's overactivity of the cervicothoracic extensors, underactivity in the mid-scapular region, overactivity over the lower pole of the thorax, very little activity over the lumbosacral junction, and then we often have increased activity in the hamstrings glutei. So that starts to affect not only the way the spine is postured, but how we move. And it's really important that you can appreciate this tendency, because we're dealing with the brain here. The brain is, these patterns have been accruing over a long time. We talk about neuroplasticity, and for most of us, our movement is automatic. And so when you're asking a client to do something, they'll do it from the way they know. So it's our job to intervene, to try and down-train the overactivity, think about it in the muscles with the heavy hatching, and to bring in and facilitate the deep system. And essentially the key approach, the key moves, is really about how to help your client engage their deep system. The research is very clear that it's underactive, and certainly it's evident clinically. So if we look to the next one, this really, if we can just click on that again, so give me another click, thanks Hilary. Here, it's the same figure, and this is what I'm trying to show here. I've got her palpating over her lumbosacral junction because I want her to sense, in fact, I'm trying to get her to do a little bit of first pattern, but that's by the way. But what we see here as an increased lock-in, what I call a central posterior kinch over that thoracolumbar spine. Notice here this divot, which I call the key sign. And as soon as you see that in someone, it's always apparent when you get this increased activity over the thoracolumbar extensors. And that has an inhibitory effect on being able to develop good core control. So we don't want to increase that activity. We've got to try and we've got to understand and ask ourselves, is the exercise I'm giving helping move this patient out of that tendency, or are we just entrenching it? So if we look at the next one, this just is a bit of a snapshot about really what happens is what I call the centre. The yellow line is really where your belt line is, about where your tummy button is. And if you look at the patient from the front, they have variables. Some people have overactivity in the upper abdominal wall. That's going to be your anterior pelvic cross group. But note the underactivity below the belt. Essentially, what this is showing is too much is happening above the belt, not enough below. So lumbo-pelvic control will suffer here, but also the ability for that lower pole of the thorax to be able to open out and to be free to move starts to become compromised because of the tethering effect of this overactive myofascial components. And as I say, they vary according to which cross syndrome the client is in. So if we look to the next one, helping you to appreciate what happens inside the body. So the centre in the figure is conceptual, that if someone's well aligned, there is a balance in the axial on the trunk, flexors and extensors. And they move in and out depending whether you need to bend forward or bend back, essentially. But in the upright anti-gravity position, and this is what we're dealing with here, how the body deals with the force of gravity. It's how our movement systems learn to evolve. So in the centre, nice open cavity. If we look at the PPX, we've got a lot of tension being generated over the posterior spine, and notice the poor abdominal tone, the over-descended diaphragm. So this person can't generate the internal pressure mechanisms very well. And I'm particularly talking here about intra-abdominal pressure, which is very important anterior support for the spine. If we look to the right, the person with an anterior pelvic cross syndrome has too much abdominal tone, and this inhibits the way the diaphragm can descend, and again, inhibits their ability to generate tone. So let's try and look at all this, because we're looking at the upright body. So a good and easy way to do it is in sitting, and it's helpful since we're probably all sitting in front of computers. And in fact, I hope you're all looking about the way you're sitting. So if we can have the next slide. So I'm trying to wrap all this up into what happens in sitting. And if we can move on, thanks. So if you start to look at your patients, and you can see I undress all my patients, I'm lucky I'm a clinician, and so, you know, I want to know what the body's telling me about them. London to a brick, it will be very unusual for you to see someone what I call sitting with a neutral spine. Some people hold themselves up. If they get a sense that they need good posture, they do it. And again, you can see the layer syndrome playing out here. The figure on the left has increased activity over her thoracolumbar extensor. She's got the key sign, but notice the very poor muscle tone over her lumbosacral area. She has a lumbosacral kyphosis rather than a lordosis. So predicted with this woman's going to have either low back pain, sacroiliac pain, and maybe a plethora of symptoms in the lower limb. The other strategy is to collapse. What I want you to notice, and it'll be probably more apparent in the next slide, is the pelvis. Notice here the spine. Notice where I've got crosses on the spine. I'm obviously marking stuff when I look at the person. But although he's collapsed, still note there's a lot of extensor activity trying to hold this spine up. Notice the bulging lateral waistline, so it tells us that he doesn't have much internal control. But the problem here is he doesn't automatically organise a good pelvic base of support. So if we look to the next one, from memory, it is someone else. So this girl, she's a computer program. She also likes to do physical culture, and she is plagued with recurring sacroiliac pain, low back pain, sciatica, hamstring tears, etc. Now this is her at rest. Notice the pelvis is dumped back into posterior rotation, and again, look at all this activity in the extensor system, again like salamis. So I use this, and the next one is that you can't want to demonstrate that you can't tell someone to sit up, because this is what she knows to do. Notice, come back to the layer syndrome, that she's using this well-known strategy of locking in her thoracolumbar extensors. And again, notice the very poor anterior rotation and the ability to get a good lumbosacral lordosis. So when I look at that, I think, well, there's no surprise that she's having problems. And again, she will be, whether you can see it clearly with the shadow line, but she's also engaging the upper abdominals there too. So this acts as a constrictor around the lower pole of the thorax, and that's going to constrict how she can get the internal support and the easy way of being up against gravity. So if we look at the next one to see what is nice sitting. So this is a really nice way. And if you think about it, how often do you see people sitting freely well in an effortless way? This is how the spine is happiest. I call it coming home. The spine's got to be able to do numerous things during the day, come in, come out, but it needs to return to a comfortable place that was energetically efficient. And it does that best when the pelvis can be in its neutral position, which is actually in some anterior rotation. And then she's getting nice upright support of the spine where the head can be balanced on the top. And that's a really nice neutral. So you can see that she can do it. This person is a yoga teacher. So our job is to try and help our clients. And so to do that, if we can look at the next slide, we see a picture of the lower pelvic unit. This is this continual myofascial sleeve that is such a multitasker. It is doing so much stuff from continence to breathing. Here we're looking at its role in postural control. If we can look on to the next slide, which is taken from Freedom to Move, it is attempting to give you an understanding of the way that the diaphragm in particular with the pelvic floor and transverses work together to generate intra-abdominal pressure. And here I'm wanting to demonstrate that the intra-abdominal pressure, because the diaphragm, this is the diaphragm where those lines are, and this is a slide that bears some studying, that when these three elements that I mentioned can work together, the pressure, intra-abdominal pressure created pushes out against the lower rib cage, what I call opening the centre, and provides anterior support for the spine. If we come to the next slide, also involved in this discrete coordination is our breathing mechanism, which is quite a complicated affair. I've taken this lovely picture out of Donna Fahy's book because I think it just easily shows that the ideal pattern of breathing, note that it's down in the body, which is what we mean by deep breathing. It often gets construed as big breathing. However, in a dysfunctional state, notice here in this diagram, she's showing a lot of tension around the lower pole of the thorax. The patients are pulled in and therefore they start breathing up in their shoulders. So if we're going to help our clients, if we can move to the next slide, thank you, we have to be able to get the sequences right. And really the first thing to getting a good core activity is to help the patient get a good diaphragmatic breath, which is easier said than done, particularly in the posterior pelvic cross syndrome. Until they can get an effective breath, they can't develop good intra-abdominal pressure, which is basically the pattern of the axial fundamental pattern. And then you've got to be able to do that as you breathe. And we're going to look at that in a moment. When you're trying to activate the axial fundamental pattern, it's important that it can be isolated to being able to control the thorax. Your clients will try and control it by clutching the muscles over their inferior pelvis, what I call an inferior tether, and try and do it from their pelvis. On the other hand, when we try and retrain the pelvic patterns, particularly first pattern, the patient will try and do that by locking in with a central posterior kinch. So we really firstly have to stage this somewhat. We'll never get it perfect before we can move on, but we've got to get some ability in the axial pattern and before retraining the pelvic patterns, and particularly the first, and this also goes for the shoulder patterns. Otherwise, we risk, come back to the layer syndrome, of this common tendency to compensate, to increase our kinching behaviour, and this will only further jeopardise core control mechanisms. So if we could move on, I'm not sure where we're up to. So we drill, we're not going to do this because we're all sitting, but basic actions. Pinning the beetle is the basic action, and that's in the book. And then when that's established, we can start to challenge their ability. And if we move on to the next slide, we see that baby pose is another way that we can start to get the patient sensing what's happening. We always begin the training in line because that circumnavigates the postural system. It gives us an access route into the brain, because this brain has been trying to sort out how we are upright, and that has become a pretty automatic thing, the way patients organise it. So we're trying to give the brain a rest, to give them the ability to make changes and sense the change and grow that. We're trying to help them develop their sense of interoception, which is very important in getting these fundamental patterns, proprioception, etc. So then, as we start to get that happening in supine, we start to work more against gravity. So sitting is a good way to do it. So if we can have the next slide. And here, what the subject is practicing drilling, opening the centre. So this is getting the axial pattern. So I'm going to get you all now to come onto the front of your seats, and I hope that you're on a firm seat. It's really important that, you know, I use balls sometimes, but not a lot, because when you're trying to activate the postural system, you are using the ground reaction force. So be on the top of your sit bones and place your hands around the lower rib cage. With your thumb, feel...
Joe, would you move back from the screen, please? Thank you. We need to be able to see you.
Okay.
And tilt your screen down a bit. And then when you need me to do something, I'm on the edge of my seat.
Okay. So thumbs circling, thumbs are behind over the lower rib. Find that. And then you're gently wrapping around the lower ribs and then dropping your shoulders and widening your elbows. So to get this pattern in sitting, you are thinking you're not lifting the shoulders. That's really important, that you are expanding back into your thumb and sensing an expansion sideways into the web of your hand. So from this position, the ability to bring the lower rib cage wide. And when this action is correct, the whole lower abdominal wall engages. Notice I've said nothing about pulling in or pulling up, but this ability to open the centre three-dimensionally. It's a bit like imagining that you're growing round inside. So it's important that the emphasis is back into the thumb and that back web of the hand, the ability, and this will tend to reposition the rib cage in space, which is a problem for a lot of people. And then they're asked to hold that opening and allow the breath. So be really careful when you start to work with breathing, is because people try and too hard to breathe. The breath should be naturally able to come and go, whatever our body is doing. Here, we're making space for the breath. We're sensing the engagement of the lower abdominal wall here. And just getting the sense of being up. The job of the spine is to lengthen in whatever position we're working in, and the job of the centre is to open. The people that find this particularly difficult are the people that are the PPXs. How to reposition this rib cage back, and this is why we do these drills on the ground, and then to maintain that position, which then gives them support for the front of the spine, freeing up the girdles. So people are asked during the day to have practice sessions doing this. In the early stages, we talk about sitting upright on the sit bones with support at the back of the chair. When to challenge your ability to open this up, we ask for holding open. Again, if we come back, Elizabeth, dropping the shoulders, and again trying to bring this opening backwards and sideways, feeling the lower abdominal wall, the lower pelvic unit on, and then trying to maintain that upright, thinking about the body as a cylinder, as you lightly peel one heel off and unweight one leg, and keep breathing. So this is starting to task what this can do. Can you get it in neutral? Can you get it while you breathe? Very nice, Elizabeth. I'm so pleased to have my subject here. So now, having seen that aspect of control, beautiful. Look at that. So now can we come, I think the next slide we were looking at the pelvis. So I'll get my trusty pelvis. Can you see me? Am I in screen here? So the pelvic patterns, they are really important for initiating movement initiated from the base of the spine. The spine doesn't do a lot of movement initiation. It's a follower from what happens in the head or the shoulder girdle or the pelvic girdle. And the pelvic girdle is prime. What I want you to notice is these big spaces on the internal pelvis. And that's what the lower pelvic unit is involved inside. And so the internal control must match.
Joe, please back up a little bit. Just keep backing up. So, no, back up. Thank you. We need to see a full pelvis. Great.
Okay. So you can see it there. So
yes,
the pelvic patterns move the pelvis round in space. They tip it, rotate it on their femoral heads, but they also can change the shape and the volumes of the pelvis. So here is our innominates, and pelvic patterns are all initiated with the focus in the brain on the sit bones and tailbone. We're going to be looking at the first and second. So I'm showing you the pelvis from the side in its neutral position. You can see there's the tailbone there, and that's about a good standing position. If we tip it back or tuck the tail where the client's sitting on their tailbone, the spine will be flexed. If we bring it back, we get extension of the lumbosacral spine. So this is first pattern, this ability to anteriorly rotate. But if I turn the pelvis to back view, it's important that as the pelvis anteriorly rotates, the sit bones widen, which helps the tailbone to lift. Okay? Beautiful. Now, what I want you to see with Elizabeth is that she keeps the shape of her spine. She's shifted her weight forward because she can get this hinging action in the pelvis. So let's face, if you can face the camera, Elizabeth. Okay, so we will have you to the side. Thank you very much. And I'm going to get you where you palpate is middle finger just in this inner lip here. The hands rest on that crest and just on the inner lip. And that's the deciding point. All your cues, everything you're wanting your client to do is to feel this engagement in the lower pelvic unit. Because when that's engaged, I don't mean really tense, but engaged, about 20%, it means that you're getting the activity in this inner lower pelvic unit, which is critical for being able to control the pelvic force couples. So together, everyone on the front of their seat with your legs to a right angle, fingers here, and you want to see these sit bones as rockers and to be on your rockers. So we're going to bring the sit bones, roll onto the front of the rockers and spread them, feeling the tailbone reach back. That's first pattern. And then we're going to come back, and this is where most of your clients find it easy to go into second pattern. Can you let the pelvis roll back onto the sit bones and feel how the spine flexes? So this ability to come from your pelvis and then forward again, and let's come you into first pattern. So what you're always looking here is the point of initiation. Does the pelvis initiate the movement? Now, this is probably more easily seen if we get Elizabeth facing us now on the camera. So for those of you that can see me here on my screen here, she's going to sink the left sit bone and lift the right. Beautiful. Now, what I want you, if I have your hands on your iliac crest, notice her right hand is lifted. Can you feel with your left hand, Elizabeth, how you're really engaged in your lower pelvic unit? Good. And now you're going to sink the right sit bone and lift the left. What I'd like you to notice is the way her weight shifts. Notice how her rib cage now comes to the right and the spine is free to follow. And I'm still cueing her to open the center, and she's getting a really nice natural activation of the core. Here, I haven't had to tell her to pull anything in, pull anything up. And once again, I'd like you to see again how she sinks that left sit bone. She's driving into the support here, and that will naturally activate this deep system. Feeling that on? Now we're going to do fourth pattern. So she's going to remain on her left sit bone as she brings the right sit bone forward to grow the right knee forward, and then back. So notice here the whole body rotating. As that knee comes forward, that right knee, she starts to turn to the left. And as the right sit bone comes back, she turns to the right. So notice the whole body following the spine, the head into to this movement. So this is a nice way we can get our clients to walk around the chair. The big problem that the postural system has is that so many people now work in a sedentary way in front of a computer. Being mindful of, you can feel it, just being up on your sit bones. Come, let's have you back to neutral. And so the important thing is that Elizabeth's palpating her fingers there, but to get first pattern, is she's widening the sit bones. Notice she's narrowing here. It's a beautiful way to get your lower belly working. And so I call it fanning the tail. So here, if these sit bones come back and wider, she's actually coming forward and narrower there, okay? And that then lets this tailbone come back, the sacrum moving to what we call nutation. And then she's coming ahead beautifully there, Elizabeth. We can then bring, you can see how first pattern. So now let's have that beautifully again, Elizabeth. And so she's going to keep driving those sit bones back and lifting up. Beautiful, up. And now I could make it tough for her and say lower. She's got to hold first pattern and lower. Beautiful. And up. And now let the sit bones come forward, which is second pattern. So now come up to standing and feel the sit bones come forward to bring you upright. And then if we're going to sit down with active control of the pelvis, she puts the fingers on the sit bones. Let's have them on the sit bones here. And let the knees drop forward as you float the sit pelvis back. Feel the sit bones lifting up and wide. Beautiful. And then can you stay with that and lower? Beautiful. Look at her lovely alignment of the trunk, and you can see the fulcrum of control is how the pelvis is controlled on the legs. So if we come up, how are we going for time, Elizabeth? Do you know?
Get me moving and I lose track of time. You have plenty of time. It's 37 after the hour. Carry on. I'm just fascinated with moving. Forgot the clock. Yeah.
Okay, so let's have you turning your box around so we can see the sideways view. So is that you've got, so now let's have you sitting back on your box. Lift your sit bones right to the back of the box so that your thigh is supported. That's it. So once we know, we drill these patterns in all movements. If you look at all natural movements, I mean, this is something that fell out for me. It's my understanding of natural movement. I used to work with children helping to develop movement. But if you look at it, the fundamental patterns are key players in all movement. If you look at your clients, it's what they can't do. So what we re-establish them in is we combine them and marry them with all sorts of movements. So I could again challenge Elizabeth. Now I'd like you to notice here, if I say, if you just drop your jumper down so we don't see, if you could just pull your jumper down at the back. Thanks, Elizabeth. Oh, okay, that's fantastic. Oh, look at this. Okay, lovely view of the fabulous contrast. Thank you.
That's good. Yeah.
So we saw in how to sit well. Essentially, it's got to come from the bottom up. It's got to come from that fanning of the tail as we try and also gently open out the centre body. And then the spine has its natural lift. That, you know, we shouldn't have to use too much muscle tension to be up against gravity. And this is what your clients are doing. So I'm going to ensure, can I turn that box around, Elizabeth, so that your whole right thigh is supported on it? So the sideways view, but it looks to be wider. That's the way. So her sit bones are on the back. It may or may not work, but she's going to now attempt to, I'm going to get you to bring your hands around the lower pelvic thorax with your thumb over 12th rib and to try and open out under your hands. To feel this expansion, and you should feel the muscles, particularly under your thumb, soften. So it's the ability to keep that openness and breathe. And then not only that, can you still keep open and particularly soft under your thumb as you just come in and give me a little bit more of first pattern. Sit bones, gently flare them a little bit, tailbone. So again, remember I said it's tricky to get first pattern without going hard and tense under your thumb. But what helps to stop that tension reoccurring is increased proficiency and capacity in your axial pattern. The ability to marry the axial pattern, and Elizabeth's doing it very nicely now, and she mightn't have enough thigh support. Can you try and keep your pelvis exactly where it is and open under your hands and just see if you can lift the right knee up for us now, gently without moving. So she manages to control the pelvis and to keep the centre open as she unweights. This is quite a lot of load. It's particularly asking for psoas to work, and psoas needs a good lot of stability through the intra-abdominal pressure mechanism. Another way we could challenge is if you drop your leg and let the thigh be well supported by your box. And now, if you think about the attachments of the hamstrings, they attach to the sit bones. So normally hamstrings are tight. When you ask for their lengthening, you often get the tail wagging the dog where the sit bone gets pulled under. Can you sustain? No. So again, that's what we don't want to happen. So come into first pattern, feel the firming of the lower wall, and now keep the thigh there, but just gently. So your focus now, your brain is really connected to your sit bones, keeping them wide, keeping the tailbone back, keeping the centre open, as you now just float the right foot forward to extend the knee without losing that pelvic position. Beautiful. And drop. Your client predictably will get the message that they'd like you to extend the knee and lengthen the hamstrings, so they will predictably usually lose pelvic control, and therefore the spine starts to be the compensatory area and drop. So that's just one of the ways. Let's come up to standing now. And so another way we could use first pattern, if you move your stool aside and now bring your fingers onto your sit bones. So if we can look at you from the side. So here you want the hips, the feet hip width apart, and the patient's got to be able to lower to gravity, to drop into their feet, to have a good base of support in the feet, dropping the knees forward, so lowering down, just bringing the knees forward and lowering your pelvis. And now you're going to scoop those sit bones right back in space as though you were going to have headlights in them. Bring them back and keep widening, lifting them, reaching them along. So here, beautifully, she can shift the pelvis back in space, and she's tasking, and she can really, the more she widens those sit bones, she feels the lower pelvic unit coming on by the look of it. Are you feeling that? And lifting, this ability to get what I call put your headlights onto high beam. Notice she's got flexibility in her legs and this ability to rotate and shift the pelvis back. And this is particularly difficult for the client who is an anterior pelvic cross syndrome. And then we come up to standing, what I call forward back pattern drills. Now to come up, second pattern comes in to bring the sit bones forward. And then we drop down into the feet, soften the knees, and do it again. And so we use these pattern drills to think about the way that you bend forward, making the hip pelvic complex work and helping to marry that with the spine getting its anterior support where it's lengthening. And what you can see here is that Elizabeth is not locking in a lot of tension over her lower back rib cage where her purple band is here. So it's this ability to get the reach back and the lift and the pelvis leading the movement with the spine being able to follow. All right, let's have you up. Thank you, Elizabeth. So let's have a look. I'm not sure what the rest of the slides are, but I'll just run through quickly what other things that you might do to get this sequence. So here we have someone drilling open the centre. What I'd like you to see is the very relaxed posterior extensor system. If you look at someone with good control, they don't have bulky muscles there. And so if we move to the next slide, Here we are, as Elizabeth showed us, the ability to get a lovely upright lift of the spine, nicely supported, being able to control the pointy bottom, if you think about it like that, while she unweights the legs. And again to the next. We can probably move through these pretty quickly. So here, it doesn't look like there's much happening here, but there is actually a lot happening. The flesh obviously displaces. What I'd like you to see, this is first pattern, that the legs are completely relaxed. And this is one of the big problems that you have with your clients, helping them to disengage the whole inferior myofascial chain. That she's getting a nice lordosis, which is actually more than, you know, the tissue is displacing here. But what I want you to see is the rib cage follows, but it doesn't thrust. Remember I said, because if you think about what the layer syndrome is, trying to get first pattern is a problem for many. So we have to cue them to stay wide to try and down train that. So we're trying to marry these two things. Okay, if we can have the next one. So when they get control, this ability to maintain a lordosis, where you're getting co-activation of the muscles in the lower pelvic unit with your lumbosacral multifidus. So remember, the pictures we've seen in the layer syndrome is that there's generally lack of tone there. This client is feeling for, she's obviously monitoring lower ribs, don't want them to thrust, but to the ability to maintain what I call the cubby house. Her left hand, she's feeling the activity in the cubby house, she's controlling that, and then bringing the thigh to vertical. So, you know, a pre-step to this is the ability to flex the hip without flexing the lumbar spine, and that's very difficult for some of your clients. This is the next stage. Can they keep the thigh vertical and then start to extend the knee? So remember, again, hamstrings attaching to that sit bone. So the cue here is to drop your sit bone back and wide as you float your heel tall, and notice how you're working like crazy in your lower pelvic unit. And there should be no unnecessary tension anywhere else. Okay, thank you. And the next one. So here we're playing with the patterns which Elizabeth has shown us. Forward weight shift, and again this ability to move forward, and notice how when the pelvis is initiating the movement, there is a lovely opening in the anterior upper part of the thorax. And the next one. So again, this ability is important, that as we drill what's happening in the centre, we might get the client to roll back, but can they let the rib cage come back? Can they let go of those extensor muscles and get the tummy muscles working? A lot of them will find this particularly difficult if you look at the person on the right, and I'm particularly thinking about the PPX group. They will actually extend the thorax and lock in with psoas, rather than let those grippers, if you like, at the back go, and be able to let this thorax be free to shift in space, which incidentally is the second here, the fundamental pattern that we're looking at, the second axial fundamental pattern in the thorax, following what happens in the pelvis. Okay, and the next one. This is, as I showed you, someone maintaining a nice neutral pelvis as they extend. You can see the tension in the legs, nothing like Elizabeth showed us. But note here, he's still got to work on his axial pattern. Notice the divot of his upper abdominals working, and also you can see that there's increased activity of the central kinch pattern activity over the posterior lower rib cage. And the next slide. So this is looking at forward bend. Now, Elizabeth could show us beautifully her ability to lower to gravity, to shift the pelvis back and to anteriorly rotate it, keeping a sense of alignment. So this is a conceptual drawing. However, if we look at the anterior pelvic cross syndrome, they're really good. Notice the locked legs, notice the pelvis staying posteriorly rotated. So what happens? They fold in the middle. They engage more the upper anterior abdominal wall and flex the whole spine. So when someone's doing this every time they bend over, it's creating a lot of long-term stress on the spine. However, if we look at the posterior pelvic group, they're pretty good at rotating, bending at their hips. Notice they'll still tend to lock the legs, but they lock in with more central posterior kinch activity, and there's very little activity in the whole abdominal wall. Therefore, in both scenarios, we're not good in getting good deep anterior support for the spine. So to see
Joe,
this in yes.
We are at just about 10, 11 minutes to the hour. May we start in with questions now? And
okay, or do we want to do a very quick flip to the pictures, and then I think it'll only take, what slide are we up to, by the way? Do we know? Here, just quickly, this is a personal trainer with back pain. Simply, I said bend over, you can see what's happening. Look how his pelvis is tethered, interior flexion of his spine. If we look at the next slide, he was smart, came back on the second treatment, able to organise what his pelvis does. And when the pelvis is acting neurologically, the hamstrings help to lengthen. And in my opinion, most hamstrings problems happen because people can't control the pelvis. Note he's got good alignment. Go to the next slide. Again, good yoga teachers, years of work, but notice here this ability to maintain the alignment of the spine in forward bend. Look at the lift of the sit bones. And again to the next one. So we drill this with things like supplicant pose, someone down on their knees working first pattern with the axial pattern. He's still struggling with this a bit, but we move on to the next slide. And what I want you to see is here, when first pattern happens, how the sit bones widen. A lot of your clients can't do this. Their pelvic floors are very tight. Unless those sit bones can widen and reach up, the pelvis can't rotate. Again, notice the emptiness over the lower pole of his thorax. He needs better control of the axial pattern. And the next slide. So there we're drilling him in forward bend pattern as Elizabeth showed us. Next slide. So we do things like cat-camel, where we emphasise anterior rotation without the ribs going. Here in second pattern, we really encourage expansion over that lower pole of the thorax. Your clients will lock in with the anterior chest. Next slide, I think we're nearly there. And then things like butt booster we can challenge with, maintaining alignment. Let's come to the next slide. Releasing the buttocks through first pattern and controlling the centre. And the next slide, which is our last one. And again, notice here, if you've locked the legs, you've locked the pelvis. It's so important to help your clients find that connection between their feet and their sit bones. And so this becomes a really nice opening of the whole body. And that's it. So we don't have any more slides.
Fantastic. Yes. Joe, we'll start in with the questions now from Q&A. Hillary, I don't know why there's this echo, but I'll try to control it. Okay. Andrea Clift asks, is there any spinal pain conditions that these fundamental patterns wouldn't be appropriate to teach?
Oh, what a nice question. The beauty is that anyone can do them. The importance is the discreetness of them. And that's what a lot of your clients have. So someone in really acute pain, you can help to get what I call a teensy-weensy movement. They are soothing to the spine. Your clients have mass responses. These are safe. They give patients locus of control right from day one. Nice question, thank you. The program is staged, and this is where it comes from the shop floor. I'm a clinician, a manual therapist, trying to help patients become self-treaters, if you like, showing them the way that they can help themselves. But they need a lot of guidance, which is why we run classes, because they're not with their body.
And Jane McKenzie asks, should we sit on a chair without a back to encourage the back to sit correctly?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Jane. I think sitting is really very misunderstood. Some people have got the fact that people, when they try and sit up tall, use too much tension, and so they mistakenly tell them to slump, to stop this tension over the lower back ribs. I think it's important to have a back of the chair, particularly while a person is developing better control so that they can get the support in the upright position. The importance is to have a chair with a flat seat pan and a backrest so that when they're supported, the spine is still upright and they can still think about where they're breathing and switching the core on. But then we encourage them to move forward and practice through the day. So yes, I think it is important because particularly if you're at a computer, people start to focus on the screen and the poor old brain's getting not enough information. So to have both options. If people are holding tension, that's the clue that if we give them better internal support, they don't need to use the tension. And sitting is a great way. We do lots of it. Most of us do it so badly. But if you can get what the pelvis needs to do to help you sit and what the centre needs to do to support your spine, there you're on the way.
A number of people have expressed, quote, pelvis envy, and they would like to know about your pelvis, meaning the model.
Yes.
Katrina Patterson says, I love your pelvis. The one I have is very fixed. Where did
Yes.
you get yours?
I got it from a guy called Jerry Hesh. Someone asked me the other day and I can't find it to reply back to them, so apologies to whoever that was. I think he's a physio or a chiropractor in America, Jerry Hesh, and it's wonderful because this is the problem. We see pelvises stuck in, and if, you know, it just helps you to really tease out the fundamental patterns and how they alter the shape, because it's this pelvis being able to change what it does. This is what happens in rotation. That's where the spine gets its rotation. So look up Jerry Hesh, G with a Jerry, and he's somewhere in the States.
He owes you now. Yep. Andrea Clift asks another question. Is the layer syndrome different to the crossed syndromes? Do I do something different for each of them?
Oh, Andrea, what a wonderful question. Well, I did say, but I probably went through quickly that the stratification syndrome is really what the pelvic cross syndromes do to your body. If you're looking at the pelvic cross syndromes, we look at them from the side, and that helps us understand how this imbalanced myofascial activity is pulling the spine off its centre, if you like. But if you get either cross syndrome, will be reflected in the layer syndrome. So the layer syndrome is really looking at the body from the front and the back. It's easier to see from behind, but you get the same thing happening from the front. Too much activity of sternomastoid, too much pectoral activity, maybe too much abdominal activity, lower abdominal activity, too little, maybe too much hip flexor activity. So you're still seeing this banding or strata that we do. So the layer or stratification syndrome, as it's known, is another conceptual thing looking at the front of the back body. And again, I'm indebted to Yanda for that because it's so important to understand, because that's what they'll keep doing. And it's to understand the interrelationship of posture and movement. We look at them posturing, where they go to, and that will play out all the time in movement. So it allows you to predict. And when you're in a class, that's what you're cueing against. You're trying to bring them out of that and to bring in what this deep system does.
Joe, before we continue with questions, let's go to the slide so people know how the discount code for ordering your book and how they can get in touch with you also. So you'll note that at the top of this slide is the email address for Josephine Key, joeskey@bigpond.com, and on Facebook, The Key Approach, and also Key_moves. And you note that Handspring offers a special discount code for people who participate in this webinar or watch it on YouTube. Freedom to Move has a 25% discount off, and you can see the code to order the book. That code expires December 30th. We're looking forward to our next trying to move the chat out of the way. We're looking forward to our next event on Wednesday, January 13, a new year, and we trust a new lease on life for everybody. Wednesday, January 13th with Trina Altman, Yoga Deconstructed, Movement Science Principles for Yoga Teachers. Now, Joe, back to the questions at hand that are accumulating. Lucy asks, in general, if the person has a good axial fundamental pattern, do the ribs not move in and out with the breath?
Ah, it's a good point. Very good point. A good axial pattern in its kind of neutral state is the ability to open and to be able to breathe, but also to remain open and move. It's not a fixed state. We have to go to the most simple to help the patient get it. And I do warn everyone, probably the most difficult thing to teach well is the axial pattern. I took some slides off that because it's a staged process and you need to really be helping your client get the stages. But it's important, for instance, if you come into, let's say, if you can see me here, am I on a chair there? So let's say here, we're open, but then I'm going to get you to initiate with the third pattern. The rib cage has to be free to move, but still be on, okay? So if you think of a dancer, they're putting their body in all states, but they're still getting that interior support. So our first thing is to get it in a neutral position, but then this was the point of, can they let it drop back as they come back? Can they hold it there? Can they lift one arm up and let the ribs follow? So it's a very dynamic, adaptable. In our classes, we actually use what I call our key moves called retrainer belts, and they are over the lower pole of the thorax. So the cues would constantly be soften under your belt, open under your belt, fill out under your left button. These buttons go over 12 ribs. So the whole time, whatever you're doing, and of course, as the classes develop, as they get control, you're starting them to establish the basic patterns, and then you're weaving them and incorporating in all other exercises. So once you get the basics, it's limitless what you can do with them, okay? So you're putting them into movement, but you're always coming back to what your center doing. Let it move, open it out. Remember, they will want to lock in with these muscles around the lower pole of the thorax because that's what they've been used to doing. And so their neuroplasticity has led to these bad habits gradually accumulating over time, but we can tap into that to change it. And that's so you're really working with the brain, helping them to organise different movement behaviour. And it's a lovely question because, no, you've got to get it there before you'll get it off to the side. But it's important, for instance, to be able to go off to the side because that helps you to let go. The more those outer muscles, it's this balance between inner and outer. We want more inner, which opens out, and those muscles don't need to work so hard.
Katrina Patterson, she's on a mission to get that pelvis, and she wants to know, how do you spell Jerry's last name?
H-E-S-C-H. And I can't think of it. I met him at a conference, and I think he's in California somewhere or somewhere near you.
Oh, probably. Most people are in California that have movable pelvises. Okay. So, Joe, would you? Oh, here we go. Yes, Jerry
Yes,
Hesh.
that's
Handspring
it.
is putting it in the chat. Very good.
Yes.
Joe, given that it's taken decades of exploration for you to distill the key patterns, the key approach that are in your book, would you tell us the story of your professional life? Because you told me that you started as a pediatric physio and then explored many movement approaches.
Yes, I did a number of things. I suppose I used to work in adult rehab and then pediatrics, and that's where I was working with children with developmental delay. And so
Was that
I
in
had
the
to understand.
80s? That in the
Yes, it would have been.
1980s? Yeah.
Yep, that in the 1980s. So how do we construct movement? It was a very valuable time, and I've come back to it, of course, with this work. And we were looking at inhibiting unwanted responses, a method called the Bobart method. So I was facilitating, helping babies to find their motor movement development in an orderly sequence. But also I was working with adolescents with scoliosis. And I was really appalled how they were put into braces and operated on. You know, this wonderful system called the spine had these rods this long with wires. And I thought there's got to be a better way. I'm a physical therapist. And so I left the hospital and I worked in private practice. I decided that I really wanted to follow what the spine did. So I worked in a general practice where you're mostly getting spinal stuff, but sports injuries. I did a postgraduate course in manipulative therapy, thinking that would give me all the answers. It didn't, but it certainly helped my manual skills development. So I started my practice in 1985, and, you know, if you're in private practice, you've got to get results. So that's the driver of my inquiring, if you like. So having done the MANIPS course, I developed, put a lot of energy into developing manual skills, but my big problem was, but why are they all getting this pain? Why are there so many people? How can I? What's good exercise therapy? Looking at the research, looking at what my patients told me. And so the initial thing, I suppose, was being able to gradually describe this model of what was going wrong. What is a model of dysfunction? It was my first paper that was produced. And because I think you've got to be able to describe what's wrong before you can lead them into somewhere that's healthier. And I say to my clients, exercise therapy should be tailored to the problem the client has. If you go to the doctor, you want the right pills. If you go to a movement therapist, can they see what your difficulties are? Can they break it up and guide you in a stepwise progression so that you develop this freedom to move? And I love it after our classes when patients say, oh, that was hard, but I feel so energized and free and easy, because we've helped to put them through where they find out. Because if you look at clients, you must see it all the time too. So my journey for movement, I'm flipping ahead of myself, really, look, I'd done yoga, as I say, not too well, and I've been a bit slack at times, but I looked at Pilates. I was getting a lot of people with injuries. Pilates, what's Pilates about? What's the thinking behind the model? Feldenkrais was a very important. I did some early workshops before I did my next course with Tom Hanna. I felt grateful to have done workshops with him. He wrote a beautiful book called Somatics, very importantly influence on me. I did some Feldenkrais workshops with Frank Wildman, and that was a fork in the road. Was I going to keep on doing movement stuff, or was I going on the manual therapy? But I did the manual therapy and it didn't give me all the answers I wanted, so I went back into the movement stuff. And that going back was looking at people like Mabel Todd, Irmgard Batenia, all your probably influences, Lulu Swigard, they're all little curls, Peggy Hackney, lovely things. So it's like, what are my clients doing? What can't they do? Then I'm going back into the way movement develops, because I sort of understood that development seat. So it's been a nice coming back home to marry it all together, really, I suppose. But the need came from the clients, just so that there weren't so many of them out there needing operations, having their life destroyed. That's been them. And I guess having gone into spines, they're complex, but they're magical too. It's really interesting it's wonderful to see people evolve, to see their brains evolve, really, and to see to live well. It's about trying to live well. But bear in mind, my population are people that have broken down. All my patients come to me with pain. And so I've got to sort it out. I've got to do something manually usually to help move them on from that. But then I try, when pain's fairly settled, is to move them on so that they can experience movement and change their persistent, repetitive, dysfunctional responses into something more functional. But that involves mindfulness. They need to own it a bit. They need to be on the journey and quite interested. But again, that's where classes are lovely, because it gives us the opportunity to let them explore. I'm more directive than, say, Feldenkrais was, because I'm seeing the problems and cueing against that. So I'm knowing what I don't want too much of, which hopefully is what mapping out the syndromes helps you to see. And if you study those drawings, it'll help you to get to grips. It takes a while, but then you think, oh, you know, and I say to people, don't believe what I say, just look at your clients and they'll fall out. Mind you, the pictures I show are going to be the more extreme because it's easier to see. And you would know, again, Elizabeth, picking up movement faults, it's such a lovely art. It's why I love working with Pilates practitioners, because I'm afraid to say, on the whole, my profession isn't very movement literate, which is a sad thing. And the Pilates people really know about their bodies. And so, you know, it's got to be in there yourself to be able to help teach someone through. So I suppose I'm just trying to point a pathway if you've got the patient in pain. And that's where I make it very clear, this is helping someone get to where they can really be more active. But you can put the fundamental patterns into anything. High sports training, in your Pilates reformer, you know, when they, let's say you've got them in a forward bend of the leg out, are they really getting that pelvis leading it? And so it's the, I call them key points of control. It's when they're able to initiate and the spine can be allowed to follow. And that's usually the problem. They can't get this proximal initiation from their centre, from their shoulder girdle, head even, and pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is the big one, but they're all important because the shoulder's important for the upper spine. We can't get into that.
Wonderful. Jo Key, thank you very, very much for this gorgeous hour. And I recommend everybody to your book, Freedom to Move. And I look forward to our next time together. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, very much.
Thank you, Handspring. Bye.